Nobody wants you, Nina. Not your father, not this family, and certainly not anyone in that ballroom. She leaned closer. Just look at yourself. You don't belong in places like this. Girls like you don't fit into elegant parties. Chloe laughed under her breath. Two women nearby exchanged amused glances. One of them whispered, "Poor thing." Nina felt heat rise to her face. She stepped backward slightly, intending to leave the crowd, and that was the moment the room changed. Across the ballroom, near the bar, a tall man set down his glass. Victor Romano had been watching the exchange from across the room. The orchestra continued playing. Conversations continued. But as Victor Romano began walking across the ballroom floor, people moved aside without even realizing why. Because when men like him decided to cross a room, the world had a quiet way of making space. And Nina Carter, standing alone beneath the chandeliers, had no idea that the next few seconds would begin to change her life forever. Victor Romano crossed the ballroom with the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to hurry in his life. The orchestra continued its gentle swing melody. Crystal glasses clinked. Conversations flowed around the room like soft background noise. Yet somehow, people stepped aside as he moved, not because anyone told them to, but because power had a way of creating space wherever it walked. Nina Carter noticed the movement before she noticed the man himself. Guests were shifting slightly, parting like water around someone approaching. At first, she assumed Victor Romano was walking toward Chloe. That would make sense. Chloe stood radiant in her gold gown, smiling brightly, clearly hoping to attract his attention. Margaret subtly adjusted her own posture beside Richard Carter, preparing the polite social expression reserved for powerful men. But Victor Romano did not stop there. He kept walking, past Chloe, past Margaret, past Richard Carter, and finally he stopped directly in front of Nina. For a moment, the music seemed quieter. Victor Romano was taller than Nina had expected. Broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that looked understated but expensive. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his expression carried the calm seriousness of someone used to being obeyed. His eyes studied her for a brief moment, not with pity, not with amusement, but with something closer to quiet curiosity. Then he extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Carter?" The room around them froze. Chloe blinked in disbelief. Margaret's smile vanished for a split second before she quickly tried to recover it. Even Richard Carter seemed caught off guard. Nina stared at Victor's outstretched hand. Her first instinct was that this had to be a mistake. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. Victor tilted his head slightly. "Do what?" She glanced around the ballroom. The whispers had already begun. People were watching. "I understand," Nina said softly. "You're trying to be kind." Victor's expression changed slightly. For the first time, a faint hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. "I assure you," he said calmly, "kindness has very little to do with it." He kept his hand extended. "Dance with me." Behind Nina, Chloe whispered sharply to Margaret. "Why is he talking to her?" Margaret's voice came back tight. "I have no idea." Nina hesitated only a moment longer before placing her hand in Victor's. His grip was warm and steady as he guided her toward the dance floor. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody. Victor placed one hand lightly at Nina's waist and began to lead the dance with practiced ease. Nina followed awkwardly at first. "I'm not very good at this," she admitted quietly. "You're doing fine." She looked up at him briefly. "People are staring." They usually are. His tone was calm enough that Nina almost smiled. For several moments they danced without speaking. Nina could still feel the weight of the room watching them. Finally, she said, "You probably should have asked my stepsister instead." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "She's the one who wanted your attention." Victor glanced briefly toward Chloe across the room. Then he looked back at Nina. "I noticed." "Then why?" "Because she wasn't the one being humiliated." The words were simple, but they landed with unexpected weight. Nina blinked slightly. Victor continued speaking in a quiet voice meant only for her. "You stood there and said nothing while they insulted you." Nina looked away. "That's not unusual." Victor studied her face. "Maybe it should be. If that moment touched you, tell us in the comments where you're watching this story from. Have you ever seen someone stand up quietly for what's right, just like Victor did for Nina? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy stories about courage, dignity, and justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. The orchestra carried them slowly across the polished floor. Nearby, 2 older guests watched the dance with interest. One of them, a gray-haired man in his 60s, leaned toward his wife. "That girl looks like she's had a hard life," he murmured. His wife nodded softly. "Sometimes you can tell when someone has learned to endure too much." Back on the dance floor, Nina felt the rhythm steady beneath her feet. "You shouldn't involve yourself in family matters," she said quietly. Victor's expression didn't change. That didn't look like a family matter. What did it look like? It looked like cruelty. Nina didn't respond. The music slowed as the final notes approached. Victor gently guided her through the last turn before releasing her hand. The applause from nearby tables was polite but brief. Nina stepped back slightly. "Thank you," she said. Victor nodded once. "You're welcome." But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he studied her again. "You work somewhere called Maple and Ink." Nina blinked. "How do you know that?" "I pay attention." Her confusion deepened. Victor slipped a business card from his jacket and handed it to her. "If anyone gives you trouble tonight," he said calmly, "call that number." Nina looked down at the card. It simply read, "Victor Romano," and a phone number. When she looked up again, Victor was already stepping away. Across the room, Margaret's face had turned pale with anger. Chloe looked furious. Richard Carter looked confused. The whispers around the ballroom had grown louder. Nina slipped the card carefully into her purse. She didn't know why, but something about the moment felt important. Across the ballroom, Victor Romano returned to the bar. His longtime associate Matteo leaned closer. "You just created quite a scene," Matteo said quietly. Victor picked up his glass. "Did I?" Matteo nodded toward Nina, Carter's daughter. Victor watched Nina standing alone near the edge of the room. "Yes," he said calmly. "I know exactly who she is." And for the first time that evening, a faint, thoughtful look crossed his face. Because Victor Romano had been noticing Nina Carter long before tonight, and now that he had finally stepped into her world, things were about to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. For several minutes after the dance ended, Nina Carter remained near the edge of the ballroom, trying to steady the strange mix of emotions moving through her chest. Embarrassment was still there. So was confusion. But beneath those feelings was something unfamiliar. Attention. Not the cold attention of judgment she had known for years, but the quiet awareness that someone powerful had chosen to notice her. Across the room, conversations had resumed, though not quite the same as before. Whispers drifted through small clusters of guests. That was Victor Romano. Why would he dance with her? "I thought that girl was the forgotten Carter daughter." Nina tried to ignore the murmurs. She walked toward one of the long tables near the wall and picked up a glass of sparkling water. Her hands were steady now, but inside she could still feel the echo of the music and the memory of Victor Romano's calm voice. Because she was the one being humiliated. The words repeated quietly in her mind. Behind her, heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. Nina didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Nina." Margaret's voice carried a thin edge. Nina slowly turned. Margaret stood there with Chloe beside her. Richard Carter hovered slightly behind them, looking uncomfortable. Margaret's smile was tight. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Nina blinked. "I didn't do anything." "Oh, really?" Chloe snapped. "You didn't do anything?" "Victor Romano just walked across the entire ballroom to ask you to dance," Nina said quietly. "I didn't ask him to." Margaret stepped closer. "Then why you?" Nina had no answer. Margaret studied her carefully, as if searching for some hidden trick. "You embarrassed this family for years," Margaret continued softly. "And suddenly tonight you decide to perform." "I wasn't performing." Chloe crossed her arms. "You must have done something. Men like him don't notice girls like you." Nina lowered her eyes slightly. "I didn't do anything." Richard Carter finally spoke. "That's enough." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. He looked at Nina briefly. "Stay near us for the rest of the evening." Then he turned away, already distracted by someone calling his name from across the room. Margaret exhaled slowly. "See?" she murmured. "Even now he's trying to protect you from yourself." Chloe leaned closer. "You should probably leave before you make things worse." Nina remained still. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the immediate urge to obey. Before she could answer, another voice interrupted. "Miss Carter." Nina turned. A tall man in a dark suit approached with a polite nod. She recognized him from earlier. He had been standing near Victor Romano. "My name is Matteo," the man said calmly. Margaret stiffened slightly. Yes, Nina replied. Mr. Avent. Romano asked me to deliver a message. Margaret's eyes narrowed instantly. Matteo's expression remained neutral. He asked if you would join him at the bar for a moment. The silence that followed felt heavy. Chloe laughed sharply. That's ridiculous. Margaret forced a polite smile. I'm afraid Nina is busy with her family. Matteo glanced briefly at Nina. Of course, he said calmly. The invitation is entirely hers to accept or decline. Then he stepped back, waiting. The decision now belonged to Nina. For a moment she hesitated. Years of habit told her to refuse. But something deeper inside her, something that had been quiet for a long time, stirred. She looked toward the bar across the ballroom. Victor Romano stood there, speaking quietly with another guest. Yet even from across the room, his posture suggested that he already knew the answer she would give. Nina turned back toward Margaret. I'll be back in a few minutes. Margaret's composure cracked. You most certainly will not. Nina met Hargaza. Yes, I will. The words surprised even her. For the first time, Margaret looked genuinely startled. Nina walked away before anyone could stop her. The distance across the ballroom felt longer than before. Guests watched as she approached Victor Romano. When she reached the bar, he turned toward her as if he had been expecting her arrival all along. Miss Carter, he said calmly. Nina stood beside the counter. You asked to see me. Victor nodded slightly. Yes. The bartender placed a glass of water in front of Nina before she even asked. Victor gestured toward it. You looked like you might want something non-alcoholic. Nina blinked. Thank you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Nina said quietly, You caused quite a situation tonight. Victor lifted one eyebrow. Did I? My family is not happy. That doesn't surprise me. Nina hesitated before asking the question that had been bothering her since the dance. Why did you ask me to dance? Victor studied her expression carefully. Then he answered in the simplest way possible. Because I wanted to. That's not a real answer. It's the only one that matters. Nina considered that. You don't even know me. Victor took a slow sip of his drink. I know enough. What does that mean? Victor looked toward the dance floor where the crowd moved under the chandeliers. Then he said quietly, I know what it looks like when someone is surrounded by people who should care about them but don't. Nina felt something tighten in her chest. That happens more often than people admit, he continued. Nina looked down at her glass. I'm used to it. Victor's voice remained calm. People shouldn't have to get used to that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Across the ballroom, Margaret and Chloe were watching them closely. Matteo leaned toward Victor again. Your presence is creating quite a storm over there. Victor glanced briefly in their direction. Then he returned his attention to Nina. That happens sometimes. Nina allowed herself a small smile. I noticed. Victor set his glass down. Do you work tomorrow? Yes. Where? Maple Ink Cafe. Victor nodded slightly. Good coffee there. Nina looked surprised. You've been there? Once. She studied him carefully. You seem to know a lot about me. Victor's expression remained unreadable. I told you earlier, he said quietly. I pay attention. The orchestra shifted into another melody. The evening continued around them, but Nina had the strange feeling that something important had quietly begun, something that would not easily be undone. The gala continued late into the evening, but for Nina Carter, the atmosphere of the ballroom had changed completely. Everywhere she walked, she felt eyes following her. Not friendly eyes, curious ones, suspicious ones. Some people whispered quietly as she passed. Others simply stared. It was the kind of attention Nina had never wanted. And yet, somehow, it no longer felt quite as humiliating as before. Perhaps because earlier that night, someone had chosen to stand beside her instead of looking away. Across the ballroom, Victor Romano continued speaking with a small circle of business leaders. From a distance, he looked perfectly composed, the kind of man who could dominate a room without raising his voice. But once or twice, Nina noticed something strange. His gaze drifted toward her. Not long, just enough to make her wonder. She quickly turned away each time. Near the dessert table, Chloe Carter was doing her best to recover from what she now clearly considered a disaster. I swear he did that just to make a point, Chloe muttered to one of her friends. What point? The friend asked. Chloe glanced sharply toward Nina. That my family is complicated. Margaret stood beside her, her posture rigid. I don't like this, she murmured quietly. Relax, Mom, Chloe replied. He danced with her once, that's all. Margaret did not look convinced. Men like Victor Romano did not do anything casually. She knew that much. Across the room, Nina slipped quietly toward the exit hallway near the restrooms. The noise of the ballroom faded slightly there, replaced by softer echoes and distant music. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The evening had been exhausting. Humiliation, whispers, unexpected conversations. She pulled the business card from her purse again. Victor Romano. Just a name, just a number. It looked strangely simple for a man whose reputation carried so much weight. You look like someone trying to figure out whether tonight actually happened. The voice startled her. Nina turned. Victor Romano stood a few steps away in the hallway. She blinked. I thought you were still speaking with those investors. They'll survive without me for 5 minutes. Nina slipped the card back into her purse. You seem to move around this room without anyone stopping you. Victor gave a small shrug. Most people prefer not to stop me. Nina studied him for a moment. Up close, he seemed calmer than she expected. Not intimidating in the obvious way people described powerful men. Just controlled. Does that ever get lonely? She asked suddenly. Victor raised an eyebrow. What does? Being the kind of person no one interrupts. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said quietly, sometimes. The honesty surprised her. They stood in the hallway while the distant music continued drifting from the ballroom. You handled your family well tonight, Victor said. Nina let out a small breath. You mean I stayed quiet? That takes more strength than people realize. I'm not sure about that. Victor studied her face. Most people respond to cruelty with more cruelty. I've never been very good at that. That may be a good thing. Nina leaned lightly against the wall. Or maybe it just means I've learned to survive. Victor nodded slowly. Survival is an underrated skill. For a moment, the conversation settled into a comfortable silence. Then Nina asked the question that had been forming in her mind. Why do you know where I work? Victor did not look surprised. I told you. I pay attention. But why me? Victor looked toward the ballroom doors for a moment. Then he answered honestly. Because you don't look like someone who belongs in a house that treats you like a stranger. The words struck closer than Nina expected. You don't know my family. I know enough. Nina hesitated before speaking again. My father built one of the biggest technology companies in the country, she said quietly. Everyone thinks my life must be perfect. Victor's voice remained calm. And it isn't. No. A small, humorless smile touched Nina's lips. Sometimes wealth just hides the truth better. Victor nodded slightly. That's very accurate. Footsteps suddenly approached from the ballroom. Margaret Carter appeared in the hallway. Her expression hardened instantly when she saw Victor standing beside Nina. Mr. Romano, she said, forcing a polite tone. Victor turned slightly toward her. Mrs. Carter. Margaret's smile looked almost painful. I hope my stepdaughter hasn't been bothering you. Victor's response came calmly. Not at all. Margaret glanced sharply at Nina. We were just leaving. Nina straightened. We? Yes, Margaret replied firmly. The gala is ending soon. Victor watched the exchange quietly. I believe the orchestra has another hour scheduled, he said. Margaret ignored the comment. She looked directly at Nina. Come with me. For several seconds, Nina didn't move. Victor said nothing, but somehow his presence made the moment feel different. Nina met Margaret's gaze. I'll be there in a minute. Margaret's eyes flashed. That wasn't a request. Victor finally spoke. Mrs. Carter. Margaret turned slightly. Yes? His tone remained calm, but firm. Miss Carter is capable of deciding when she leaves a room. Margaret stared at him. The tension in the hallway thickened. Finally, Margaret forced another smile. Of course. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom without another word. When she disappeared, Nina let out a quiet breath. You probably just made my life harder, she said. Victor shrugged slightly. Possibly. Nina studied him. Why do you keep helping me? Victor looked directly at her, and this time his answer was different. Because sometimes, he said quietly, someone needs to. The music swelled again in the ballroom beyond the doors. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them knew it yet. But this quiet conversation in a hallway outside a glittering ballroom would become the beginning of a story that neither of them would ever be able to walk away from. When Nina finally returned to the ballroom, the music felt louder than before. Perhaps it wasn't the orchestra that had changed. Perhaps it was her. For most of the evening, she had stood quietly in the background, trying not to attract attention. That had always been the safest place for her in rooms like this. But now something was different. People were watching her. Some with curiosity, some with thin smiles that suggested gossip had already begun spreading through the room. Nina walked toward the long glass doors that opened onto the hotel terrace. The cool night air outside felt like relief after the crowded ballroom. Chicago's skyline glittered across the dark horizon. For a moment she leaned against the railing and breathed slowly. The evening replayed itself in her mind. The insults, the whispers, the dance, Victor Romano's calm voice in the hallway. "You seem lost in thought." Nina turned. An older woman stood beside her on the terrace. She looked to be in her early 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly back and a warm expression that softened the lines of her face. "I hope I'm not intruding," the woman added kindly. Nina shook her head. "Not at all." The woman extended a hand. "Eleanor Watkins." Nina blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Watkins?" The woman laughed softly. "So you do recognize me?" Nina smiled for the first time that evening. "Mrs. Eleanor Watkins owned Maple and Ink Cafe, the small bookstore cafe where Nina worked several mornings each week. Seeing her here felt strangely comforting. "I didn't know you attended these events," Nina said. "Oh, I don't usually," Mrs. Watkins replied. "But the Carter Tech Foundation supports several literacy programs in the city. I come when they invite donors." She studied Nina's expression. "You look like someone who's had a difficult evening." Nina hesitated. "Mrs. Watkins gently waved a hand. "You don't have to explain if you'd rather not." Nina looked back toward the ballroom doors. "My family," she said quietly. Mrs. Watkins nodded slowly. "Families can be complicated. That's one word for it." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Watkins spoke again. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "people often assume kindness is weakness." Nina glanced at her. "But the truth is," the older woman continued, "kindness takes a great deal of strength, especially when it isn't returned." Nina looked down at the city lights below. "I'm not sure I'm strong," she admitted. Mrs. Watkins smiled gently. "You show up every morning at the cafe. You work hard. You treat customers with patience even when they're difficult." She placed a reassuring hand on Nina's arm. "That tells me plenty." Nina felt a quiet warmth in her chest. Across the terrace doors, movement caught her attention. Victor Romano had stepped outside. He paused briefly when he saw them. Mrs. Watkins followed Nina's gaze and smiled knowingly. "Well?" she murmured softly. "That explains a few things." Nina blinked. "What does?" Mrs. Watkins chuckled. "Mr. Romano doesn't walk across ballrooms for just anyone." Nina opened her mouth to respond, but Victor had already approached. "Good evening, Mrs. Watkins." The older woman greeted him with a pleasant nod. "Victor." The familiarity between them surprised Nina. "You two know each other?" she asked. Mrs. Watkins smiled. "Victor has supported several of our literacy programs over the years," Victor added calmly. "Mrs. Watkins runs one of the best independent bookstores in Chicago." "Well," she said, amused, "that's a generous exaggeration." Victor glanced briefly at Nina. "She works there." Mrs. Watkins laughed softly. "Yes, and she's one of the best employees I've ever had." Nina felt slightly embarrassed by the praise. Mrs. Watkins stepped back toward the doors. "I should return inside before someone notices I've escaped the donor table." She looked at Nina once more. "Don't forget what I said earlier." Then she disappeared back into the ballroom. Nina watched her go. "She's a remarkable woman," Victor said. "Yes," Nina replied. "She is." The terrace fell quiet again. City lights flickered across the dark water of Lake Michigan. Victor leaned lightly against the railing beside her. "Do you always attend events like this?" Nina asked. "Only when necessary." "And tonight was necessary?" Victor considered the question. "Yes." Nina studied him carefully. "You still haven't told me why." Victor's gaze drifted toward the skyline. "Some things are easier to explain later." Nina gave a small smile. "That sounds mysterious." "Sometimes patience is useful." Before she could reply, the terrace doors burst open again. Chloe stepped outside, clearly searching for someone. Her eyes immediately locked onto Nina. "There you are." She walked toward them, her expression sharp. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Nina remained calm. "I needed some air." Chloe's gaze flicked toward Victor. "So I see." Victor said nothing. Chloe folded her arms. "Dad is leaving." Nina blinked. "So early?" "He has meetings tomorrow." Chloe's tone made it clear she didn't appreciate being ignored. We're all leaving. Nina hesitated. She glanced once toward Victor, then back at Chloe. I'll be inside in a minute. Chloe's expression darkened. No, now. Victor finally spoke. Miss Carter seems comfortable where she is. Chloe's eyes flashed. This is a family matter. Victor met her gaze calmly. I'm aware. The tension on the terrace grew thick. Finally, Chloe scoffed. Fine. She turned and marched back into the ballroom. Nina sighed quietly. I should probably go. Victor nodded slightly. Probably. She hesitated. Thank you. For earlier. Victor looked at her. You don't have to thank me. I still want to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nina added softly, Good night, Mr. Romano. Victor's voice remained calm. Good night, Nina. She walked back toward the ballroom doors. Just before stepping inside, she glanced over her shoulder once more. Victor still stood by the railing, watching the lights of Chicago. And somehow Nina felt certain of one thing. Tonight had not been the end of their story. It had only been the beginning. The drive back to the Carter residence was silent. Richard Carter sat in the front passenger seat of the black town car, scrolling through emails on his phone. His expression was distant, already absorbed in tomorrow's business meetings. Margaret sat beside Nina in the back seat. Chloe sat on the other side, arms folded tightly across her chest. No one spoke for several minutes. Chicago's glowing skyline slowly faded behind them as the car moved north along the quiet highway toward Lake Forest. Finally, Chloe broke the silence. So, she said sharply, how long have you been planning this? Nina looked up from the window. Planning what? Chloe let out a short laugh. Oh, please, don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. Margaret's voice joined in, colder and quieter. The performance tonight. Nina blinked. I didn't perform anything. Margaret turned her head slowly to face her. You expect us to believe Victor Romano suddenly decided to dance with you out of nowhere? Yes, Nina said calmly. Chloe scoffed. That man runs half the city's shipping industry. Men like him don't make random decisions. Richard sighed from the front seat without turning around. Can we not do this tonight? But Margaret ignored him. You embarrassed this family, she continued softly. I didn't do anything embarrassing. You let people see you standing there like some poor little victim. Nina felt something tighten inside her chest. That wasn't my choice. Margaret's smile returned, thin and sharp. Everything about tonight was your choice. The car continued through the dark suburban roads. Nina stared out the window again. Lake Michigan's distant reflection shimmered through the trees. After a moment, she spoke quietly. You were the one who said nobody wanted me. Margaret did not hesitate. That's because it's true. Chloe smirked. If Victor Romano wanted your attention, it was probably just a joke. Nina didn't answer. But inside, something had shifted. For years, she had accepted these conversations as normal. Tonight, they sounded different. Perhaps because someone else had seen them happen. The car finally turned into the long driveway of the Carter estate. The mansion stood brightly lit against the dark sky. When the driver stopped the car, Richard stepped out immediately. I have an early call with Tokyo, he said quickly. Good night. He disappeared inside without another word. Margaret watched him go with quiet annoyance. Then she turned to Nina. You should remember something, she said. Nina waited. This house still belongs to your father. And, Margaret leaned slightly closer, and you only stay here because he allows it. Nina met her gaze. I know. Margaret studied her expression carefully. For the first time that evening, Nina didn't look defeated. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Don't misunderstand tonight, she added. Victor Romano was being polite. Chloe laughed softly as they stepped out of the car. Yes, she said. Men like him don't fall for girls like you. Nina walked toward the front door without replying. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier than usual. Margaret and Chloe disappeared upstairs almost immediately. Nina remained in the entry hall for a moment. The marble floors reflected the soft glow of the chandelier above. For years, she had walked through this house feeling like a visitor. Tonight, the feeling was stronger than ever. She turned toward the small hallway leading to her room near the back entrance. The space was quiet. Her room was exactly as she had left it earlier that evening. A small bed, a wooden desk, a single lamp beside the window. Nina slipped off her shoes and sat down on the edge of the bed. The events of the evening replayed again in her mind. Victor crossing the ballroom, his hand extended toward her, the calm certainty in his voice, because she was the one being humiliated. Nina reached into her purse. She pulled out the business card again. Victor Romano. Just a name, just a number. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she placed it carefully on the desk. Outside her window, the lake wind moved through the trees. For the first time in a long while, Nina allowed herself to imagine something different. A life where she didn't have to shrink every time someone insulted her. A life where people spoke to her with respect. The thought felt strange, almost impossible. But tonight had already proven that impossible things could happen. Across the city, in a quiet office overlooking the Chicago River, Victor Romano sat alone at his desk. Matteo stood near the window. "You caused quite a situation tonight," Matteo said. Victor leaned back in his chair. "That seems to be the general opinion." Matteo studied him carefully. "You've attended dozens of those events over the years. You've never crossed a ballroom for anyone." Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a glass of whiskey on the desk. "I've noticed her before," he said calmly. Matteo raised an eyebrow. "At the gala?" "No." Victor took a slow sip. "At the cafe." Matteo looked surprised. "You've been watching her?" "I've been observing." Matteo crossed his arms. "And what exactly interests you about the daughter of a technology billionaire?" Victor's voice remained steady. "She's the only person in that entire family who doesn't behave like she's entitled to the world." Matteo nodded slowly. "That's true." Victor looked out the window at the city lights. "But that's not the real reason." Matteo waited. Victor's expression hardened slightly. "The real reason," he said quietly, "is that no one deserves to be treated the way they treat her." The office fell silent. Matteo finally spoke. "So what happens now?" Victor set his glass down. "Now?" A faint, thoughtful look crossed his face. "Now we see what kind of woman Nina Carter really is." Miles away, Nina lay awake in the small room at the back of the Carter mansion. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet wind outside. Neither of them knew it yet, but the quiet choices they had made that night were already beginning to move their lives toward something neither of them would be able to stop. Morning arrived quietly over Lake Forest. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees surrounding the Carter estate, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. From the outside, the mansion looked peaceful, an elegant home belonging to one of the most successful technology executives in the country. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt colder than the autumn air outside. Nina Carter woke early, long before the rest of the household. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her small room near the back of the house. The events of the previous night returned to her mind slowly, like distant echoes. The ballroom, the whispers, Victor Romano stepping across the room. For a moment she wondered if the entire evening had been some strange dream. Then she turned her head toward the desk. The business card was still there. Victor Romano. Just a name, just a number. Yet somehow it carried the quiet weight of something that could change everything. Nina sat up slowly. She dressed simply, as she always did for work. Dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, and comfortable shoes. After tying her hair into a loose braid, she slipped the business card into her purse. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her not to leave it behind. The house upstairs remained silent as she moved through the hallway toward the kitchen. She poured herself coffee and toasted a slice of bread. The morning routine felt familiar and calming. But today, something was different. For the first time in years, Nina noticed that the quiet no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Footsteps suddenly echoed from the staircase. Chloe entered the kitchen first, still wearing her silk robe. Her expression hardened immediately when she saw Nina. "You're still here." Nina continued spreading butter on her toast. "Good morning to you too." Chloe rolled her eyes. "You seem very relaxed this morning." Nina didn't respond. Chloe leaned against the counter. "I suppose dancing with Victor Romano gave you quite an ego boost." Nina sipped her coffee calmly. "It was just a dance." Chloe laughed. "Please. You looked like you'd just been crowned queen of the ballroom." Nina met her gaze quietly. "I didn't ask him to dance with me." "No," Chloe replied sharply. "But you certainly enjoyed the attention." Before Nina could answer, Margaret entered the kitchen. Her expression was carefully controlled. "Chloe," she said, "leave her alone." The sudden defense surprised Nina, but Margaret wasn't finished. She turned toward Nina with a thin smile. "You have work this morning, don't you?" "Yes." "Good." Margaret poured herself coffee. "Then perhaps you should go." Nina understood the message. "Leave." Don't linger. She picked up her bag. I was just about to. As Nina walked toward the door, Margaret spoke again. Nina. She stopped. Margaret's voice remained calm. Last night was unusual. Nina waited. But don't misunderstand the situation, Margaret continued. Men like Victor Romano don't build relationships with girls who work in cafes. Nina held Margaret's gaze for a moment. Then she said quietly, maybe not, and she left the kitchen. Outside, the morning air felt cool and fresh. Nina walked down the long driveway toward the bus stop at the corner of the street. The Carter family owned several luxury cars, but none of them belonged to her. That had never bothered Nina much. The bus ride into Chicago took about 40 minutes, and she had grown used to the quiet routine. By the time she reached Lincoln Park, the neighborhood streets were already alive with the sounds of morning traffic and coffee shops opening for the day. Maple and Ink Cafe sat on a cozy corner between two brick buildings, its large windows filled with bookshelves and warm lighting. As Nina pushed open the door, the familiar smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries greeted her. Mrs. Watkins stood behind the counter, arranging croissants on a tray. She looked up and smiled. Good morning, Nina. Nina felt her shoulders relax slightly. Good morning. Mrs. Watkins studied her face for a moment. You look tired. It was a long night. I imagine so. Nina tied on her apron and began preparing the espresso machine. Customers started arriving within minutes. Morning regulars, students with laptops, office workers grabbing coffee before work. The rhythm of the cafe felt comforting. Simple. Normal. For 2 hours, Nina focused entirely on the routine, taking orders, making drinks, chatting politely with customers. It was almost enough to make her forget the strange events of the night before. Almost. Around 10 o'clock, the bell above the cafe door chimed again. Nina looked up from the espresso machine and froze. Victor Romano had just walked into Maple and Ink Cafe. He wore a dark coat and simple black shirt, looking far less formal than he had at the gala. Yet somehow his presence still filled the room. 2 customers near the door immediately moved aside. Victor stepped calmly toward the counter. Mrs. Watkins looked up and smiled warmly. Victor. Good morning, Eleanor. Nina stood behind the espresso machine, momentarily unsure what to do. Victor's gaze shifted toward her. For a brief moment, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Good morning, Nina. The familiarity of her name and his voice made her blink. Good morning. Mrs. Watkins gestured toward the counter. What can we get you today? Victor considered for a moment. Coffee. Nina cleared her throat. What kind? Victor looked directly at her. The one you recommend. Nina hesitated briefly before beginning to prepare a cup. Her hands were steady, but she could feel the quiet attention of the entire cafe shifting toward the man standing at the counter. When she placed the cup in front of him, Victor nodded once. Thank you. He took a sip. Then he said something that made Nina pause. I was hoping I might see you here today. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them felt anything but simple. Nina met his gaze carefully. Well, she said softly. You found me. Victor set the coffee cup down. Yes, he replied calmly. I did, and for the first time since the strange events of the previous night, Nina had the unmistakable feeling that whatever had begun between them was only just getting started. The quiet warmth of Maple and Ink Cafe felt very different from the glittering ballroom of the night before. Here, the air smelled of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries. Sunlight poured through the wide front windows, illuminating tall wooden bookshelves that lined the walls. Students sat reading near the back. 2 older men played chess at a small table near the window. Soft jazz drifted from the speakers overhead. For Nina Carter, this place had always felt more like home than the mansion she returned to every night. And now Victor Romano stood calmly at the counter holding a ceramic coffee cup as if he belonged there. Nina wiped her hands on a cloth, trying to steady the sudden nervous energy she felt. You're far from your usual environment, she said. Victor glanced around the cafe. I like places that feel real. That's an unusual answer. So I've been told. Mrs. Watkins watched the exchange with quiet amusement from the pastry counter. Victor, she said, you rarely visit in the morning. I had time today. Nina suspected that wasn't entirely true. Men like Victor Romano probably never had spare time. He created time. Victor turned slightly toward Nina again. You make a good coffee. Thank you. He took another sip. I meant it. The simple compliment made Nina smile faintly. A young couple sitting near the window whispered to each other, clearly recognizing Victor. One of them discreetly pulled out a phone, probably searching his name. Victor didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Nina moved to refill the sugar jars along the counter. "You must have a lot of important work to do," she said. Victor leaned one elbow lightly against the counter. "Work can wait an hour." "That sounds like something my father would never say." Victor studied her expression. "Your father seems busy. That's one way to describe him." Nina paused before adding quietly, "He's very good at building companies." Victor nodded slightly. "And less good at building families." Nina glanced up, surprised. "You noticed that too?" Victor's voice remained calm. It wasn't difficult. Before Nina could respond, the cafe door chimed again. Two men entered. They wore dark jackets and moved with the alert posture of people who watch their surroundings carefully. Victor noticed them immediately. They approached the counter. "Morning, boss," one of them said. Nina blinked. Victor sighed slightly. "I thought I told you both to stay outside." "We were outside," the second man replied. "Then we saw someone take a picture through the window." Victor glanced toward the street. Across the sidewalk, a man quickly lowered his phone and pretended to check something else. Victor looked back at Nina. "Chicago gossip travels fast." Nina folded her arms lightly. "You mean people already noticed you dancing with me last night?" "That would be my guess." Mrs. Watkins stepped closer. "If you're worried about photographers, Victor, the back door exits into the alley." Victor smiled faintly. "Thank you, Eleanor." Then he turned toward Nina again. "May I sit?" Nina gestured toward one of the small tables. "Of course." They sat near the window where sunlight warmed the wooden surface. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victor finally said, "You seem calmer here." "I am." "Why?" Nina looked around the cafe. "Because no one here expects me to be something I'm not." Victor considered that. "That's rare." Nina nodded. "People come here for coffee and books, not status." Victor leaned back slightly in his chair. "I envy that." The statement surprised her. "You envy a bookstore cafe?" "I envy the honesty." Nina smiled faintly. "That's not something people usually associate with your world." Victor didn't disagree. A brief silence followed. Then Nina asked the question that had been quietly growing in her mind since the previous night. "Why did you really come here today?" Victor answered without hesitation. "To see you." The directness caught her off guard. "That's very straightforward." "I prefer straightforward." Nina studied his expression. "You don't even know me." Victor met her gaze calmly. "I know you stood quietly while your own family insulted you." Nina looked down at the table. "That's not something I'm proud of." "It should be." She looked back up. "Why?" "Because most people respond to cruelty with cruelty." Nina thought about that. "My mother used to say something similar." Victor's interest sharpened slightly. "What did she say?" Nina smiled faintly. "She said dignity is something no one can take unless you hand it to them." Victor nodded slowly. "She sounds wise." She was. For a moment, the conversation drifted into a quiet space filled with memory. Then Victor glanced toward the window again. The man across the street had disappeared. "Your life may become slightly more complicated after last night," he said. Nina raised an eyebrow. "Slightly?" Victor smiled faintly. "Possibly more than slightly." Nina rested her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm used to complicated." Victor studied her carefully. "I don't think you are." "What makes you say that?" "Because complicated situations usually involve choices." Nina tilted her head. And I suspect you've spent most of your life not being allowed to make them." The observation landed quietly but accurately. Nina didn't respond immediately. Finally, she said softly, "You might be right." Victor finished the last sip of his coffee. Then he stood. "I should go." "So soon?" "Unfortunately." He reached into his jacket and placed a small card on the table beside her cup. "Dinner tonight," he said. Nina looked at the card. It was an address and a time. 7 o'clock. She looked back up. "That's not a question." Victor smiled slightly. "It can be. And if I say no, then I'll drink coffee here again tomorrow and ask again." Nina couldn't help laughing softly. "That's persistent." Victor moved toward the door. "Sometimes persistence is necessary." He paused before leaving. "Nina." "Yes. Don't let anyone convince you that you belong in the background." Then he stepped outside into the Chicago sunlight. Nina remained at the table, staring at the card. For the first time in her life, someone had invited her somewhere without conditions, and the idea felt both exciting and terrifying. Across the room, Mrs. Watkins watched her thoughtfully. "You should go." the older woman said gently. Nina looked up. You think so? Mrs. Watkins smiled. Sometimes life gives you one door. She gestured toward the card. And sometimes you're brave enough to open it. Nina stared at the address again, and deep down, she knew something important. If she walked through that door tonight, her life might never be the same again. Nina Carter stared at the small card in her hand for a long time after Victor Romano left the cafe. The address was written in clean black lettering. A restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. 7 o'clock. Simple. Direct. Exactly the way Victor spoke. Across the cafe, the morning rush slowly faded as customers finished their coffee and returned to their daily routines. The soft jazz continued drifting through the room, and the smell of fresh pastries filled the air. But Nina barely noticed any of it. Her mind was racing. Mrs. Watkins wiped the counter slowly, watching her with quiet understanding. Well, she said gently, you look like someone standing at the edge of a very interesting decision. Nina let out a small breath. I don't even know why he asked me. Mrs. Watkins smiled softly. Sometimes people recognize strength when they see it. Nina shook her head. You didn't see my family last night. I did, Mrs. Watkins replied calmly, and that's exactly why I said what I said. Nina looked down at the card again. What if this is a mistake? Mrs. Watkins folded her hands on the counter. Then, it will be a mistake you chose for yourself. Nina thought about that. All her life, most of her decisions had been made by someone else. Margaret deciding where she belonged in the house. Chloe deciding how she should be treated. Even her father deciding when she was worth noticing. Maybe it was time to make one decision of her own. The afternoon passed quietly. By the time Nina finished her shift and stepped outside, the Chicago sky had begun turning golden with early evening light. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she took out her phone. The address Victor had given her appeared on the map. 15 minutes away. Her heart beat a little faster. Across the city, Victor Romano stood near the tall windows of a private dining room overlooking the Chicago River. The restaurant below buzzed softly with evening guests, but the upstairs room had been reserved. Matteo stood near the doorway. You're taking a risk, he said. Victor didn't turn. How so? Matteo crossed his arms. Your name and the Carter family appearing in the same headlines could create complications. Victor looked out across the river where the city lights had begun to flicker on. Everything creates complications. Matteo studied him carefully. You're serious about this? Victor's voice remained calm. Yes. Why? Victor thought about the question for a moment. Then he answered simply, because she deserves better than the life she's been given. Matteo nodded slowly. Fair enough. At exactly 7 o'clock, a quiet knock sounded at the door. Matteo opened it. Nina stood in the hallway. For a moment, Victor didn't move. She wore a simple dark dress. Nothing extravagant, but the quiet elegance suited her perfectly. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and her eyes carried the nervous determination of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. Victor stepped forward. You came. Nina smiled slightly. You said you'd keep asking if I didn't. Victor gestured toward the table. Please. They sat near the window overlooking the river. Chicago glowed outside. Reflections of city lights dancing across the water. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Nina said quietly, This place is beautiful. Victor nodded. It's peaceful. A waiter appeared with menus. Victor waved gently. We'll order in a few minutes. The waiter disappeared again. Nina rested her hands lightly on the table. I almost didn't come. Victor raised an eyebrow. What changed your mind? Nina thought about it. For the first time in a long time, someone asked me somewhere because they wanted my company. Victor considered that. That should happen more often. Nina smiled faintly. You're probably the only person in Chicago who thinks that. Victor leaned back slightly. Then Chicago is wrong. They ordered dinner. Conversation flowed more easily as the evening continued. They spoke about books, about Chicago neighborhoods, about the strange balance between power and responsibility. At one point, Nina asked quietly, Do you ever wish your life were simpler? Victor thought about it. Sometimes. And then I remember that simple lives often belong to people without choices. Nina nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand that. Dinner lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time they stepped outside onto the riverwalk, the city lights shimmered across the dark water. The cool night air carried the distant sounds of traffic and laughter from nearby restaurants. They walked slowly along the river. After a few moments, Victor spoke. You don't have to go back there. Nina looked up. Back where? That house. The words hung in the air between them. Nina watched the river for a moment. For years I thought that house defined my life. Victor waited. But maybe it doesn't anymore. Victor's voice softened. You deserve a place where you're respected. Nina turned toward him. And what if I'm still trying to figure out who I am without all of that? Victor's answer came gently. Then you take your time. For a moment, the city felt quiet around them. Finally, Nina smiled. You know something? What? My mother used to say something when I was younger. Victor waited. She said sometimes the people who claim you don't belong anywhere are simply afraid that one day you'll find the place you truly do. Victor studied her expression. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Nina looked out across the river one last time. Then she turned back toward him. And maybe she was right. Victor didn't reply. He simply walked beside her along the quiet river walk as Chicago glowed around them. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring. But one thing was already certain. The girl who had once stood silently while others mocked her had finally stepped into a life where her voice and her worth could no longer be ignored. And sometimes, that was how real stories of justice quietly began. This story reminds us that a person's worth is not defined by the way others treat them. Sometimes the people closest to us fail to see our value, and their cruelty can make us believe we deserve less than we truly do. But dignity, kindness, and quiet strength are powerful qualities that cannot be taken away by humiliation or neglect. In the end, the right people will recognize those qualities. The lesson is simple but profound. Never let someone else's bitterness decide who you are. True respect and justice often arrive quietly. But when they do, they reveal the truth: everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and treated with humanity.